Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm John Connolly, the Spectator's news editor, and we're talking today about Labour's trans stance, especially after the party's appointed two new women and equality ministers this week. Joining me to discuss will be Helen Joyce, the author and journalist. Now, Helen, it seems like in recent weeks especially, there's been a bit of a shifting stance when it comes to Labour's position on trans rights. We've had Keir Starmer, for example, saying recently that he now thinks women's spaces should be protected and trans women don't have an automatic right to these spaces. But obviously it wasn't that long ago that the party was struggling to even define what a woman was. So I guess to start us off, I mean, what do you make of the new Labour government and do you trust them on these issues?
I think what people need to understand is that it was an extraordinary election campaign from the viewpoint of this issue. So Labour has known for years that there is something going badly wrong here between women's rights and the idea that people can identify as whatever sex they like. And it knows that because women inside the party themselves, Labour Women's Declaration, Women's Place UK, people like Joan Smith, Julie Bindel, J.K. Rowling, who left the party, of course, all of these women have been saying, look, we can't have things that women need if some men count as women legally or societally. But Keir, as far as we can tell, just didn't think that was a serious issue and certainly didn't think it was a serious electoral issue. And looking back at the election, I think we can say that in terms of votes, it isn't a serious issue. Like, they've just won a landslide, for goodness sake, despite the fact that their policy on this really is not the good policy. What it is, it's an issue for government. And we know this for several reasons. One is if you look at what happened in Scotland, this issue was a big part of what brought the SNP and in particular Nicola Sturgeon to grief. They forced gender self-ID through. They saw, rapists put in women's jails. It was incredibly damaging and made it almost impossible to govern, in fact. It broke up their coalition with the Greens. And then if we just look even at the last 6 weeks, the way that the election campaign has gone, like if you were going to be the new prime minister, and you knew, there's a cost of living crisis, there's war in Ukraine, there's war in the Middle East, most of your MPs have never been in a government before, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Do you seriously want to be answering questions about how many women have penises? It's literally the most stupid question that could possibly be distracting you. And this is the way it's going to continue for the entire of his time in Number 10 if he doesn't sort this issue out. The question is, does he understand what he needs to do to sort it? So on the one hand, we see opinion polls saying, as one did for More in Common, that people are very bored of the trans issue. They thought it was talked about too much during the election campaign. And then on the other hand, we have people saying that they very much value single-sex spaces and they think that women should be able to have spaces that no man is allowed into, no matter how he identifies. And I think that what we need to get across to Labour is, yes, people are bored with this focus on a tiny number of people who deny their own sex. No, people are not at all bored about the question of what children are taught in school, who gets to be in women's sports, who gets to be in women's prisons, and so on. And they need to stop thinking of the second of those, women's rights, as being about trans rights. We made this video of some things that happened during the election campaign at Sex Matters, where I work, and it was clip after clip of politicians being asked about women's rights and answering about trans rights. I'm not interested in the tiny number of men who don't like being men. I'm interested in the 100% of women who are actually women and what those women need. And the sooner Keir and his government work out that important shift, the quicker they will be to see what needs to happen.
Yeah, I wondered if that sort of complacency was on show this week. I don't know if you saw that Lisa Nandy, as the new culture secretary, said, well, we're not going to fight culture wars anymore. And it almost seems to be that impression of, yes, it's the very divisive Tories who keep bringing up these problems. But in reality, if you're in power, you're actually going to have to come up with policies, right?
Yeah, but it's worse than that, actually. It's that the person who's saying men can be women is the person who's starting the culture war. Like, for the entire of human history and prehistory, and in fact the 1.2 billion years that there have been sexed individuals of various species on this earth, it has been the case that there are two sexes. Some species can change sex, but no mammal can, and in particular humans can't. That's how it was until a half a second ago. Then along came people saying that you can change sex, that men can come into women's spaces, maybe if they've got a government issued bit of paper, maybe if they just say they're women. And then that means taking things away from women. It means taking away the right to say to men, get out, no men here, in places that we need to be able to say that. So they're the culture warriors. Lisa Nandy's the culture warrior here. So that's a problem, thinking about this as something that they're the ones in the right and the other side are fighting, as opposed to realising they started the fight. But you said a good word, you said policy. I'm not really interested in people's answers to the talking point question, which is, what is a woman or how many women have penises? What I'm interested in is policies and laws. Is it possible for women to have spaces where they need there to be no men and to say that no men can come in? Is it possible for service providers to do those? Is it possible for sports to be women only? Do we keep men out of women's prisons? Those are all policy questions. And as soon as people move away from the gotcha and the performative stuff, which, by the way, Rishi Sunak was very good at, he said over and over again, I know what a woman is. A woman is an adult human female. Did he fix the law? Did he fix the policies? No, he did not. They've been in power for 14 years now, the Conservatives, and all this rot happened while they were there. So, if I were Labour, I'd say, look, we passed the Equality Act in 2010, and we should return to that. Sex is a protected characteristic in it. We need to make that law work for women.
I mean, going back, I mentioned in the beginning there that Labour have appointed ministers for women and equalities. So we've got Annalise Dodds, who seems to be sort of the main person behind it, but also Bridget Phillipson. What did you make of those appointments, and do you kind of trust those two women to protect women's spaces, for example?
So both of them moved a fair bit in the last couple of years. Like both of them, in particular, Annalise Dodds said some quite flannelly answer a couple of years ago when she was on Women's Hour and she was asked what is a woman, and she gave the flannelly answer about how it depends on the context. And the trouble is that legally it actually does depend on the context. But of course, in reality, it doesn't. We all know what a woman is. But she's moved since then. For a year now, she's been saying she does know what a woman is. And Bridget Phillipson wasn't shadowing the Women and Equalities beat. She was the Shadow Education Secretary. So she wasn't being constantly put on the spot on this issue the same way that Annalise was. But the most important thing about Bridget Phillipson is that in that shadow job, she immediately welcomed, without qualification, the pretty good guidance that the Tory government brought out a draft of for trans issues in schools, like how you deal with gender questioning kids. So that, to me, I was pleased when she was appointed as Education Secretary because she was on top of it from that point of view. And then the other thing was she was asked during the election campaign a question about men going into women's toilets, and she gave what she thought was the legal answer, which is that if the man has a piece of paper from the government saying he's a woman, he's entitled to go in. But that's factually incorrect. It's a misunderstanding of how equality and anti-discrimination law work. There's actually no law saying who can go into what toilets. What there is there's a law saying, are you allowed to provide single-sex services as a service provider? It's on the service provision side, not the individual using it side. And then the next time she was asked, she gave much better answers and had clearly gone off and got herself briefed. So I want to wait to see what they do. I want to see when they're actually in power, do they do the things we need, which is to clarify the law, which is to clarify the Equality Act, and to make sure that schools stop teaching children nonsense like that sex is a spectrum, and bring in trans guidance that actually protects all children, safeguards all children, which means recognising that no child can change sex.
I mean, you mentioned we've sort of got to put our faith a bit in what's going to happen with this Labour government. Do you think there's a problem in the sense that the Tories, all their pressure from the activist base, say, was fairly gender critical, but Labour's going to have the situation where a lot of their activists, a lot of their voters are kind of opposed to that? And do you think they're going to start to cave now that they've actually won votes? And I think there's probably an acceptance in the party that to win votes from your sort of normal members of the public, you kind of have to be able to say what a woman is. But do you think now they're in power, there's a risk that the pressure's all going to be coming from the activist base the other way?
The activist base, very possibly, but not voters. Labour's own opinion polling and our opinion polling, when we've asked people what party they voted last time or what party they're intending to vote for, Labour voters aren't any more keen on this nonsense than anybody else is. They really aren't. They're really at the same place as the general public. The problem for political parties is, of course, the people who are in the political parties are not good representatives of the general public. And that's true for all of them. You can imagine what the various versions are. For Labour, it does mean a lot of young students who have imbibed all this identity stuff about race and gender in university, and who somehow have got in their mind the idea that the single most important social justice issue of our lifetimes is that men are allowed to call themselves women. And they will keep going on and on and on about that. But listen, Keir Starmer faced down, before he faced down after Jeremy Corbyn, all the anti-Semitism stuff. The guy has shown himself to be ruthless when he needs to. The question is, does he understand he needs to do this? I don't know that he's there yet, but I hope the last 6 weeks of the election campaign gave him a test for how he really does need to do this.
So I wanted to ask you about another policy area, which is one that actually made it into the Labour manifesto, which is on conversion therapy. And in particular, Labour have said they're committed to I think they describe it as a trans-inclusive conversion therapy. Is that something you worry about as well?
Yeah, a lot. It sounds great. These are the very worst policies, the ones that sound great but are actually a disaster in practice. It's really hard to explain to somebody why you're against conversion therapy ban, because they think that you have to be, for torturing kids who are going to grow up gay or something. I mean, for the record, I have 2 sons and one is straight and one is gay, and I don't want to torture either them or any other children.
That's good. That's good to know.
Yeah, I know. Controversial. The issue is that being gay and having a trans identity are really very different things. Like, we know from decades of people trying to change people's sexual orientation that it doesn't go well. Like, you shouldn't need to anyway, but it doesn't go well. You can't do it. Whereas gender identity is not a stable construct, especially in childhood. So most children who say that they think they're the opposite sex or that they're non-binary or whatever, they grow out of it, like really most. Because it's an expression of something that's temporary around puberty or to do with being gender non-conforming, or you don't realise that you're actually someone who's going to grow up gay, and then puberty comes along and you are, and it all becomes clear. So those kids in particular, what you need to do is to hold space open for them. Like to say, what does it mean to you that you think you're really a girl? Do you mean that you want to go and do ballet? Do you mean that you don't like rugby? Do you mean that you're, struggling with your puberty, your body in puberty, those sorts of things? You need to do proper talking therapy. But that is being cast as conversion therapy by activists who believe that we all come with a pre-installed gender identity. And they think that people talking like this are like the people who used to give gay people electric shocks and diversion therapy of various other sorts in order to try to torture them into being straight. It's actually the opposite, because so many of those kids with this gender identity confusion are going to grow up gay if you leave them alone. So it's really hard. You think that took me 2 minutes, and people don't have 2 minutes, and politicians don't give you 2 minutes to explain this. And I happen to know from what I've heard from activists inside the Labour Party that they're really very keen on this particular policy for 2 reasons. One is they think that it'll get their own, far left identitarian wing off their back. But the other one is it's free. And, there's a lot going on and there's not enough money. So they're really not very keen to let something go that's free and will keep the activists off their back. So what we've done at Sex Matters is we've sent a letter to the PM, and we have set out 5 tests, rather like Gordon Brown's 5 tests about going into the Euro. Fine, if you want to do this thing, fine, but are you sure that it passes these tests before you do it? And the overarching one is, are you sure you can do this without causing harm to gender non-conforming youth, to family life, to free speech, to ethical therapy, all of those things? If you can do it that way, fill your boots. But if you can't, stop and think, because you could cause really grave harm. There's this chilling effect already where therapists aren't willing to talk to kids who say gender because they're afraid of being reported as conversion therapists.
And it seems, after the Cass report, it seemed fairly obvious that this policy is almost against it, because, like you say, the report made clear that the vast majority of children with gender dysphoria don't go on end up transitioning. I think Labour's position on the Cass report was quite good, but do you think they've sort of accepted that there is a bit of a conflict there?
No, because they've put both of them in the manifesto and they are flatly contradictory. You cannot both implement the findings of the Cass review, as they said they will, and bring in a full-fat trans and gender identity conversion therapy bill. You can't do both of those. I mean, Cass herself said, of course she's against conversion therapy, but she thinks that any law would be incredibly hard to frame without catching the sorts of open-ended therapy that were precisely what she identified as best practice. I mean, the other thing, which I hope that Labour gives some thought to, and I hope that people in the Equalities Office do this, it's not like the Conservatives didn't try this too. They said they were going to do it as well. And the way that Labour wants to spin this is, the mean Conservatives, they said they were doing it, they were lying, they didn't do it, we'll do it. Actually, what happened is they meant it, they were going to do it. And then they looked into what would happen if they did put it into law. And people came along to them and said, do you understand this is going to be used against parents? Do you understand that a school that tries to run single-sex spaces and to say to a boy who identifies as a girl, look, fine, you can identify as a girl, but you can't come into the girls' toilets, is that school going to be accused of committing conversion therapy? They heard from therapists who had already given up working with children at all because they were afraid of being accused of being conversion therapists. They saw what happened when there was a conference. I was at a one-day medical conference about how to treat children with gender dysphoria. It was in London a couple of months ago. And people banged on the door and tried to get in, and they're shouting, Cass kills kids, Cass is social murder, like they're calling Hilary Cass a conversion therapist. So the Conservatives kept trying to do it and working out that they couldn't actually write a law that would not catch things that shouldn't be caught. And also, by the way, most of the things that people talk about as conversion therapy, they're already illegal. You're not allowed to torture people. You're not allowed to strap people down and give them electric shocks. So what's the law meant to be for? That's why the Conservatives didn't do it, and I hope that Labour learns from them.
I don't think we'll ever stop politicians banning things that are already illegal, mind. I wanted to ask you one final thing. You obviously mentioned there has been a bit of a positive shift from Labour in this, but there are some Labour MPs who've been kind of right on this from the beginning. In particular, I'm thinking of Rosie Duffield. She's obviously, it seems, a bit dissatisfied about the way that kind of hasn't been acknowledged. Do you think Labour maybe needs to do a bit more to kind of do a bit of a mea culpa and say, yes, we got this wrong? For the fact that we had now ministers who were saying not that long ago that male rapists should go in women's prisons, for example. Or do you think they're kind of fine to brush it under the carpet? Sorry, that was a bit of a leading question at the end there.
I mean, nobody's ever said sorry to me for the awful things they've called me. And, I've had people come up to me afterwards and say you were right. And I've heard people, like friends have told me that people who ceremonially cut me off for all of this stuff, they've met them a couple of years later. And those people have said, are you still in touch with Helen? She was right about all of it. Not one of those people has ever reached out to me to say you were right. I think it's a mug's game waiting for people to say you're right. What I care about, and what I've cared about since the beginning in this, and I know this is the same for Rosie, is I care about the fact that vulnerable children are being put on a path to lifelong harm and sterility. And if they stop doing that, I don't care about apologies. I just want them to stop harming people. I want them to stop doing awful, awful things like putting rapists in women's jails and stop sterilising gay kids. And then they don't have to say sorry. Just get on with it. Think about policy.
Thank you very much, Helen.